Hello, my name is Judith. I'm 61 years old, and what I'm about to tell you is the story that changed my life forever. Years ago, my twin sister betrayed me in the worst possible way. She stole my husband and the life I had built with him. The pain was unbearable, and I swore I would never forgive her. I rebuilt my life piece by piece, learning to live with the emptiness she left behind. Then one night, many years later, I heard a soft knock on my door. When I opened it, there she was, pale, trembling, her eyes filled with something I couldn't name. "Please," she whispered, "I have nowhere else to go." I wanted to shut the door, to turn her away forever. But something in her eyes stopped me. She reached into her coat and handed me a small wooden box. Her voice broke as she said, "It's time you knew the truth." My heart pounded. I didn't know if I was about to face another betrayal or finally uncover the secret that had haunted me for years. What was inside that box changed everything I thought I knew about my sister and about myself. But before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love reading your messages and discovering where you are in the world. Now, let's find out how this story really began. I used to think that time could dull any wound, that if I buried myself in quiet routines, morning coffee, the sound of rain on my porch roof, the smell of the old cedar floors, I could forget the face that haunted me. But even after 15 years, my sister's face never really left me. It was always there, in the mirror, in the reflection of shop windows, in dreams that ended with me waking up breathless and hollow. That night, the knock on my door came softly at first, 3 hesitant taps. I almost ignored it. At 61, I valued my peace, my solitude. My home in Portland wasn't much, 2 bedrooms, a small garden, and a cat who preferred the neighbor's porch to mine, but it was safe. It was mine. Then came another knock. Sharper this time. I sighed, wrapping my cardigan tighter around me, and went to the door. When I opened it, the world tilted. Eleanor stood there, my twin, my betrayer. Her once glossy hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sunken and rimmed with shadows. She was trembling, clutching something close to her chest, a small wooden box worn smooth with age. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The porch light flickered above us, throwing long, broken shadows across her face. "Please," she whispered, "I have nowhere else to go." It was the same voice that once soothed me to sleep when we were girls. The same voice that had called my name as she ran off with my husband 15 years ago. My fingers tightened on the doorframe. "You have a lot of nerve coming here, I know." Her lips quivered, "but I need you to listen, just for a moment." I wanted to slam the door, to end this cruel apparition before it could open old wounds. But something in her eyes, fear, deep and raw, rooted me to the spot. "What is that?" I asked, nodding toward the box she held. Her hands shook as she held it out to me. "It's time you knew the truth." The truth. Those words snapped something inside me. "The truth?" I scoffed. "The truth is that you seduced James at our anniversary party. The truth is that you ran away with him while I was caring for our dying mother." Her eyes filled with tears, her voice breaking. "That's what I let you believe. But Judith, please, just open the box, before it's too late." Her desperation unsettled me. My heart was hammering, but I reached out anyway and took the box. It was lighter than I expected, the latch cold against my trembling fingers. I carried it to the small table by the door, the same table where I left my keys and unpaid bills. The hinges creaked as I lifted the lid. Inside lay my mother's old diary, faded blue leather, edges frayed. Beneath it, a stack of hospital records, yellowed photographs, a few folded letters. I picked up one of the photos. My blood ran cold. It was a picture of James, taken years ago. He was standing outside a hospital I didn't recognize, his arm around someone I didn't know. The date on the back was a week before our anniversary, the night everything fell apart. James planned everything, Eleanor whispered, and I was too weak to stop him until now. He's not who you think he is. I stared at her, the weight of years pressing down on me. You expect me to believe that after what you did? I don't expect anything, she said softly. I just need you to see. Her voice trembled, but there was conviction in it, a kind of quiet courage I didn't remember her having. For a fleeting moment I saw the sister I once trusted with every secret. Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her coat pocket, glanced at the screen, and froze. Her face turned pale as wax. "Oh God," she whispered. "He knows I'm here. What are you talking about?" "James," she said, her voice barely audible. "Lock the door. Now." My hand instinctively went to the bolt, sliding it shut as she stepped backward into the living room. She looked terrified, her breath coming in short gasps. I tried to steady my voice. "You're saying, James, my ex-husband is after you?" Eleanor nodded, eyes darting to the windows. "He'll come. He always does when I try to leave." Her words sent a chill through me. For 15 years, I'd pictured them living comfortably somewhere, maybe in California or Europe. In my imagination, they were happy, rich with guilt perhaps, but happy nonetheless. The idea that James might be a threat had never crossed my mind. "What happened to you, Eleanor?" I asked quietly. She sank onto the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Too much," she said, "but I'll tell you everything. I just needed to get here first." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, rain began to fall, soft, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I could hear my own pulse echoing in my ears. Eleanor looked around the room, her gaze settling on the old photographs on my mantel. One of them was of us, taken when we were 21. We stood arm in arm in front of our parents' house, laughing at something the photographer had said. We were inseparable, then two halves of the same whole. "What happened to us, Judith?" she murmured. I swallowed hard. "You happened." She winced as if I'd slapped her. I turned away, trying to calm the storm rising inside me. 15 years of anger, confusion, and loss, all of it swirling just beneath the surface. But even as I told myself not to care, I noticed the bruises faintly visible beneath her sleeve. The thinness of her frame. The way she flinched at sudden sounds. Something was terribly wrong. "Why now?" I asked finally. "Why come back after all this time?" Her eyes filled again. "Because I'm running out of time. And because you deserve to know the truth before he destroys anyone else." The words hung between us like smoke, thick, choking, impossible to ignore. I wanted to ask more, but the fear in her eyes silenced me. For the first time in years, I felt something unexpected. Protectiveness. I closed the box gently, tracing the grooves in the wood with my fingertips. My mother's diary, the hospital records, the photographs. Each piece a puzzle I didn't yet understand. Somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning of something I'd avoided for too long. The past, it seemed, had found me again. Eleanor's phone buzzed once more, vibrating against the coffee table. She didn't move to answer it. Instead, she whispered, "If he comes here, promise me you won't open the door." I stared at her, then at the locked front door, where rainwater streaked the glass like tears. Outside, headlights flashed briefly down the street. My heart jumped. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. Fear, not just for myself, but for her. For the sister who had once destroyed my life, and who, against all logic, had just brought it crashing back into motion. I stood there, holding that small wooden box like a lifeline, unaware that it contained not only the truth of what had happened, but the key to everything I thought I'd lost. And as thunder rolled over Portland, I whispered to no one in particular, "What have you done, Eleanor?" She looked up, eyes glistening with guilt and sorrow. "What I should have done a long time ago," she said softly. "Tell you everything." The moment I closed the door behind us, I felt the weight of the night pressing in. The rain had grown heavier, a steady percussion against the windows, filling the silence between us. I could feel Eleanor's fear, raw, tangible, almost contagious. My anger, though still burning, was tangled now with something else. Pity, confusion, that old instinct to protect her, buried under years of resentment, stirred like an ache I didn't want to feel. I led her into the kitchen. The lights flickered briefly as the wind howled outside. That small, familiar space had once been my sanctuary, the place where I found comfort in simple things, the hum of the refrigerator, the chipped floral mugs, the soft tick of the wall clock. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a confession booth. "Sit," I said quietly, pulling out a chair. She obeyed without a word, wrapping her arms around herself like she was afraid to fall apart. Her coat was soaked through. I could see the damp fabric clinging to her wrists. She looked so fragile, as if one harsh word from me could shatter her completely. I turned to the coffee pot, my hands trembling as I poured water, scooped grounds, pressed the button. The smell of brewing coffee, warm, bitter, grounding, filled the air, clashing with the chill of unease that had settled between us. When I set 2 cups on the table, I realized how my hands shook. "Start talking," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You came here for a reason, so talk." Eleanor nodded slowly and reached for the small wooden box I'd left on the counter. She opened it carefully, as though the contents were sacred, and drew out the worn blue diary. I recognized it immediately. Our mother's handwriting, looping and delicate, covered the faded cover in faint imprints from her fountain pen. I hadn't seen it in decades. I'd thought it was lost. 3 months before Mom died, Eleanor said. Her voice barely more than a whisper. James went to visit her. Alone. "Do you remember?" I frowned, sifting through memories like old photographs. "Yes. He said he wanted to say goodbye properly. I thought it was thoughtful of him." I gave a small, humorless laugh. "Maybe I even bragged about it to you." Eleanor didn't smile. She turned the diary to a page marked by a pressed violet, one of the flowers Mom used to grow on the porch of our childhood home. "Read this," she said, pushing it toward me. I hesitated before touching it, afraid of what I might find. The pages felt fragile beneath my fingers, soft and yellowed with time. The ink was faded, but clear enough to read. "James asked disturbing questions today about my will, about the inheritance. He doesn't know I changed everything last week. I don't trust his interest in Judith. There's something cold in his eyes. I wish she could see it too." My breath caught. I read it again, slower this time, tracing each word with my fingertip. The handwriting was undeniably hers. The words, the suspicion, they sliced through the carefully constructed narrative I'd told myself for years. "What does she mean? She changed everything?" I asked, my throat tightening. Eleanor met my eyes. "Mom left everything to you, Judith. The house in Seattle she never told us about, the investments, everything. She said it was because you were the responsible one, the one who wouldn't waste it. James found out the day before your anniversary." The cup slipped from my fingers and clattered against the saucer, spilling coffee across the table. I barely noticed the burn as it splashed my hand. "What are you saying?" I demanded, though my voice trembled. "I'm saying he seduced me to get me out of the way," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes filling. "He needed you isolated, vulnerable. He knew how loyal you were, how forgiving. He thought if I took the blame, you'd never look past your anger to see the truth." I stared at her, stunned. "You expect me to believe you were just, what? A pawn in his game?" "You destroyed my marriage, Eleanor." "I know," she whispered, "and I will never forgive myself for that. But it wasn't love, Judith. It was manipulation. He told me things. Lies about you. About Mom. About everything. I was weak, and I let him use me. But that's not even the worst part. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with unshed tears and regret. I could hear the clock ticking, each second heavy and loud, marking the space between what I once believed and what I was beginning to suspect. What could be worse than that? I asked finally. Eleanor looked down at her trembling hands. There are things in those hospital records you haven't seen yet, about Mom's medication, her treatment, and about how James interfered. A loud knock at the door cut her off. The sound jolted us both. My heart leapt into my throat as I turned toward the window. Through the rain-smeared glass, I saw headlights in the driveway. A sleek, dark car idled there, engine humming, lights cutting through the storm. Eleanor's face drained of color. It's him. For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. My mind went blank, my body frozen between instinct and disbelief. "James?" I whispered. She nodded, clutching my arm. "He followed me here." The knock came again, louder this time, steady, deliberate. Not the knock of a neighbor or a stranger. It was familiar, confident, the kind of knock that once made me feel safe. I felt the years collapsing inside me like paper. The memories of his voice, his smile, the way he used to call me Jude when he wanted to soften me, all of it came rushing back, twisted now with something darker. "Don't open it," Eleanor breathed. "Please, Judith. You don't know what he's capable of." But I did, didn't I? Or maybe I was only beginning to. I could feel the pulse of adrenaline in my veins, the heat in my chest. My anger, once buried under layers of grief, flared to life again. Not the old, bitter anger toward her, but a new, sharper fury. If what she said was true, James hadn't just broken my heart. He had orchestrated every fracture. The knock came again, 3 times in slow succession. Eleanor's nails dug into my wrist. "He'll lie to you. He'll twist everything. That's what he does." I turned toward her, my voice steady, despite the chaos inside me. "Then it's time he learns I'm not the same woman he left behind." Her eyes widened. "Judith." But I was already walking toward the door. Every step felt like walking into a storm. I could feel his presence even before I saw him, familiar, magnetic, dangerous. Part of me wanted to see his face again, to look him in the eye and finally demand the truth. The other part wanted to bolt the door and hide forever. I reached for the doorknob and paused, the sound of the rain thundering in my ears. Behind me, Eleanor whispered, "Please be careful." I didn't answer. My hand was shaking as I rested it on the cool metal. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the faint outline of his shadow through the glass. When I finally turned the lock, I caught my reflection in the window. A woman older, harder, but alive. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving the past. I was confronting it. I wasn't ready for what waited on the other side of that door, but I opened it anyway. And there he was. James. I felt Eleanor's whisper like a blade against my skin. "Don't answer it." But my feet had already moved. 15 years of small, sharp grief's anniversaries spent pretending I wasn't lonely. Holidays where her laughter echoed in rooms that knew me as half of a duet had been piling up inside me like unread mail. Tonight, the knock that echoed through the house was the first one that might open an envelope with consequences. And I wasn't going to let fear keep me from seeing what was inside. When I opened the door, James filled the frame like a memory come to life. He was older. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes and a touch of silver at his temples, but he still carried that ease that once made my heart trip. He smiled in that practiced, effortless way, the same smile that had once made me believe I'd found a safe harbor. "Judith," he said, and the name came out soft, like something meant to soothe. "You're looking well." The casualness of his voice made something inside me harden. "What do you want, James?" I asked. The porch light haloed him, and for a second I was dizzy with the past, the way he'd kissed my forehead in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, the way he'd whispered plans for a future we'd never share again. He stepped forward, hands visible and empty, the posture of a man who wanted to appear harmless. "I came for Eleanor," he said, and his voice was that same smooth, concerned tenor I'd loved and trusted. "She's not well, you know, early onset dementia. She gets confused, makes up stories." The way his mouth shaped the words, so carefully calibrated, made my skin prickle. I crossed my arms, leaning into the shield I'd built over the years. "Is that so? She seems pretty clear-headed to me." My voice was quieter than I intended. It was a line drawn in the rain. He lowered his voice, leaning closer like he wanted to tell me something private. Something between two people who'd shared a life. "Judith, I know you're angry about what happened, but Eleanor needs help. Professional help. Let me take her home." "To your home?" I arched an eyebrow. The incredulity tasted like metal. "Funny, because according to these hospital records, you've had her committed 3 times in the past 5 years. Not for dementia, for delusions about financial fraud." For a heartbeat, something slackened in his expression, just a flicker, like the smallest ripple across a smooth pond. "Those records are private," he said, voice taut. "Where did you—" "She brought them," I said, and held up Mom's diary like a talisman. The leather was cracked around the edges, the pages soft under my fingers. "Want to explain why you were so interested in Mom's will?" He blinked, and the smile that had been armor fell away. There was anger now, thin and sharp. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, as if the sentence itself could teach me humility. "That money is mine by right. I invested 15 years into this family." My laugh, short, brittle, surfaced before I could catch it. "Into deceiving this family, you mean?" The words surprised me by how steady they were. There was a strength in my chest I hadn't expected, like a plant that had survived a long winter and suddenly found sun. I felt it then, solid, real, and unanswerable refusal to be small any longer. He took a step closer, and the polite veneer dropped like a mask. His voice narrowed, low and dangerous. "Give me Eleanor, or you'll regret this." There was no melodrama to his threat, no theatrical flair, just clean, cold intention. It landed in my bones with a weight I could not deny. I could see it in his eyes now, the way they hardened when a plan didn't bend to his will. The man who'd once promised me a life now used the same confidence to steer, to control, to erase. I smiled back, but it was a smile with no warmth. "Get off my property, now." The words were quiet, but they carried the sound of finality, a hinge closing on the past. He studied me for a long moment, like someone cataloging a new specimen. Then, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed, he turned and walked to his car. He moved with the arrogance of a man who believed he could reclaim what he thought he had lost. The taillights glowed through the rain as he drove away, and when they disappeared, the street felt emptier, like a wound reopening and then closing again. I closed the door and slid the bolt into place. For a long time, we sat in the hush that followed, the sound of our breathing louder than the rain. Eleanor had come into the kitchen leaning on the counter, her face a map of relief and exhaustion. She broke into small, ragged sobs, the kind that no longer demanded loudness, but simply needed to be let out. I moved to her, held her, and felt the weight of her body sag with the release. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered between tears. The words were fragile, but they were a bridge. I did not know what to do with gratitude toward the woman who'd once taken everything from me. It felt both foreign and necessary, like learning to walk with a cane when your legs are new to the weakness. When she had studied, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and sat down at the table. "There's something else," she said, folding her fingers over the diary as if it were the only anchor she had left, "about why I really came here today." I made coffee, again, more out of ritual than thirst. The steam curled up between us, perfume for the ritual of sitting and listening. The kitchen felt smaller now, intimate in a way that made every confession feel monumental. I looked at her, and for the first time in years, I let myself see the person beneath the betrayals. The small girl who had once braided my hair. The sister who had whispered promises in the dark. "You mean besides the money?" I asked, then immediately wished I hadn't sounded so blunt. But bluntness had a use. It made the truth less theatrical and more real. Eleanor drew in a shaky breath. "I found out I have stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said. The sentence was stripped of flourish. It sat on the table between us like the scariest object imaginable, unornamented and absolute. "They told me 3 months, maybe less if I do nothing. I'm not looking for pity, Judith. I'm looking for forgiveness and help." The world narrowed to that single fact. For an absurd, involuntary second, I thought of the small box, the diary, the photograph of James outside a hospital. I had been busy assigning motives and villains and had almost missed the human heart beating beneath the mess. My first response was a rush of old defenses, anger, a litany of grievances. And then, beneath it, under the crisp edges of all that I had endured, something softer took hold. Sorrow for the sister who had carried on like a tightrope dancer above an abyss of shame and fear. I felt my breath hitch and the tears prick behind my eyes, uninvited and unexpected. "You should have told me sooner," I said, voice raw. It was a reproach and a plea braided into one. "You shouldn't have come alone." Eleanor's laugh was small, brittle. "I was ashamed," she said. "Ashamed and scared and too proud to show weakness. He told me if I complained, people would think I was hysterical. He told me I'd lose everything if I left. He used my illness against me, said he'd be the one to care for me if I didn't make a scene." The way she said it, the casual cruelty of his manipulation, made bile rise in my throat. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a clarity that made me ache. The pressure to sign things, the disappearances, the quiet isolations. He'd constructed a narrative where he was the concerned husband, the sole responsible party, and in that narrative he'd silenced questions by making them seem like expressions of madness. "What did you want me to do?" I asked more gently. "When you left me that night, did you want me to forgive you? To follow you? To understand?" She looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the old softness, the sister who had once shared a sleeping bag with me, who had drawn me pictures when the nights were cold. "I wanted you to hate me less," she whispered. "But I also wanted to survive. And when I realized what he was after, it was already too late. He had the leverage. He had the money. He had," her voice broke, the rest of the sentence swallowed by tears. I reached across the table and took her hand. It trembled in mine, a leaf in a breeze. "Then we'll unmake him," I said, though I wasn't sure exactly what that meant yet. The words came out less like a plan and more like a vow. In that vow was a promise to myself that the life I rebuilt from the ruins would not be one of quiet resignation. Eleanor nodded, eyes wet but steady. "I've been collecting pieces," she said. "Bank statements, emails, letters. I stashed them in a safe deposit box downtown. I couldn't risk having them here. He's been watching me. He's watched me every step of the way." A fresh tremor passed through me, but it was no longer purely fear. It was a galvanizing heat anger sharpened into purpose. The betrayal remained, heavy as ever, but now it shared space with an ember of resolve. For the first time since I'd opened the door, I felt like I was not only a woman who had been wronged, but a woman who could act. Outside, the rain softened to a steady rhythm, as if the world were holding its breath with us. We sat there, 2 women bound by blood and history. And in the small kitchen that had witnessed my tears for so many years, we began to map a future neither of us had expected to share. We would need a lawyer. We would need proof. We would have to risk more than comfort and sleep. But for the first time since Mom's funeral, I felt the two halves of my life begin, very cautiously, to stitch themselves back together. Eleanor squeezed my hand, and in that simple pressure, I felt both apology and appeal. "I'm sorry," she said, the words small in the vastness of what it tried to mend. "Then start by staying," I answered. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." She took a breath deep enough to steady her voice, and as she spoke, I listened, tracing each word like a map, watching for the sharp turns and sudden drops. The diary lay on the table between us, its pages a quiet witness, and outside, the rain tapped like an anxious audience waiting to see what we, together, might do next. The rain had finally stopped by morning, but the clouds still hung low, pale and bruised like the aftermath of a long argument. The air smelled of wet cedar and the faint metallic tang that always followed a storm. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a mug gone cold, trying to absorb everything Eleanor had told me the night before. When she returned from the bathroom, she looked smaller somehow, her skin almost translucent in the dull light, the hollows beneath her eyes deep as grief itself. She was clutching a thin folder, and her hands trembled so violently I rose to steady her. "I have to show you something," she said. Her voice was soft, but there was a steel edge under it, the kind that comes from someone who's already stared down despair and decided to speak anyway. She sat, sliding the folder across the table toward me. Her eyes didn't meet mine as she whispered, "It's my medical report." I hesitated before opening it, but she didn't wait for me to ask. "Stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said, matter-of-factly, as if reciting a statistic. 3 months, maybe less. The world seemed to tilt, and I felt the air leave my lungs in a rush. The anger that had built over 15 years, layer after layer of resentment hardened like stone, suddenly cracked. Beneath it, there was only ache. Whatever she'd done, however much she'd broken me, she was still my twin. The person who knew the shape of my childhood laughter, the one who shared my first breath, my other half. Eleanor. The word came out like a plea, heavy with everything I hadn't said. She held up a hand, cutting me off gently. "I don't want your pity," she said, though her lips quivered. "I want your forgiveness. And I want to help you get back what James stole." Her gaze sharpened, determined now, and she took a slow, deliberate breath. "The Seattle house Mom left you? James forged your signature and sold it 5 years ago. The money went into offshore accounts." For a long moment, I could only stare at her. The words seemed unreal, floating in the air between us like smoke. I felt myself sink slowly into my chair, the weight of betrayal settling on me all over again, but this time it wasn't just emotional. It was tangible, legal, criminal. "How much?" My voice was barely audible. $3 million, she said, almost apologetically. "Plus the investments another 800,000. He's been living off it while telling me we were struggling. That's how I found out the truth." I covered my mouth with my hand, as if that could stop the wave of disbelief threatening to spill out as a sob. James had taken everything, my trust, my marriage, my dignity, and now I learned he had taken my future too. The quiet life I'd built after losing him suddenly felt like a shadow of the one he'd stolen. Through the window I noticed movement. My neighbor, Mrs. Chun, was tending to her front garden despite the drizzle. She caught sight of me and frowned, tapping lightly on the glass before mouthing, "Is everything okay?" I nodded, forcing a small smile. She didn't look convinced, but she smiled back anyway. Her presence, simple, caring, constant, brought me an unexpected sense of steadiness. This neighborhood had held me up more than once, even when I was too proud to admit it. When I turned back to Eleanor, she was watching me, her eyes wet. "You've built a good life here," she said softly. "I can see it in the way people care about you." "I had to," I replied, managing a weak smile. It was the only way to survive. We sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then I spoke, the words coming out clear and certain. "We need a lawyer," I said firmly, "and we need proof." Eleanor gave a small, tired smile. "I've been gathering evidence for 2 years," she said. "Bank statements, emails, the forged documents. It's all in a safe deposit box downtown. But there's a problem." I straightened in my chair, bracing myself. "What problem?" She hesitated, her fingers twisting in her lap. "James has a new target, a wealthy widow in Seattle. He's planning to marry her next month. If he does, he'll transfer everything to shell companies we can't touch. Once that happens, the trail goes cold." I felt something deep inside me shift an ember that had lain dormant for years, finally catching fire. The quiet woman who had once retreated from confrontation was gone. In her place was someone older, stronger, forged in the quiet furnace of loss and humiliation. I stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. "Then we have less than a month to stop him," I said. The certainty in my voice startled even me. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly, but then she nodded, her trembling lips curving into the faintest smile. "That's the Judith I remember," she murmured. For the first time in years, I didn't flinch from my own reflection in the window. I saw the streaks of gray in my hair, the lines at the corners of my eyes, but behind them, I saw resolve. There was power in age, I realized. In endurance, the kind of strength that came not from untouched beauty or blind optimism, but from surviving everything meant to destroy you. The sudden buzz of a phone shattered the fragile stillness. Eleanor reached into her coat pocket and glanced at the screen. Her face went pale, the light from the device reflecting the tremor of fear in her eyes. "Judith," she whispered. "James just filed a restraining order against me." I blinked, unable to process it for a moment. "What?" "He claims I'm dangerous and delusional," she said, her voice breaking. "The hearing is tomorrow morning. If he wins, I won't be allowed within 100 feet of him. I won't be able to testify or hand over the documents. It'll all be dismissed before it even begins." She dropped the phone onto the table, and I picked it up. The message from her lawyer glowed in black and white, official and cruelly sterile. "Emergency hearing set for 9 a.m. Respond immediately." I felt my pulse quicken, the injustice of it all flooding through me. "He's trying to silence you," I said, fury trembling under my words, "to paint you as unstable just like he did before." She nodded weakly. "He's good at it. Charming, convincing. By the time he's done, I'll be the crazy sister with a vendetta." "No," I said, my tone so sharp it startled her. "Not this time. He underestimated us before. He won't again." Eleanor looked at me, uncertain. "Us?" "Yes, us," I repeated, firmer now. "You're not doing this alone anymore. We'll go to the hearing together. I'll find an attorney, someone who knows what these men do, how they manipulate records and people alike." Her eyes filled again, but this time the tears came slower, steadier. "You'd really do that for me? After everything?" I reached across the table and took her trembling hand. "You're still my sister," I said softly. "That means something, even after everything that's happened. Maybe forgiveness isn't a single act. Maybe it's a series of choices." Her grip tightened, fragile but full of gratitude. "You always were the strong one," she said. I shook my head. "No, I just learned to survive longer. Now it's your turn." We sat there until the light outside began to fade, the day closing in around us. The air in the kitchen was heavy with exhaustion, but also with a strange, tender calm. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the fragile beginning of something like it. When Eleanor finally drifted off to sleep on the couch, I stayed awake, watching her chest rise and fall in shallow rhythm. The night hummed with quiet resolve. Tomorrow would be brutal. James would twist the truth, and the system might still side with him. But I would be there. I would speak. For years, I had told myself I was done fighting. But as I looked at my sister, the woman who had betrayed me, suffered beside me, and now, perhaps, was seeking redemption, I felt a fierce, unwavering clarity. I wasn't just standing up for her. I was standing up for every woman who had been silenced, doubted, or erased. When I turned out the light, I whispered to the dark, "He doesn't know it yet, but he's already lost." And for the first time in 15 years, I believed it. I hardly slept that night. The muscles in my jaw ached from clenching. The clock on the nightstand seemed to mock me with its steady, indifferent tick. I lay awake replaying fragments of Eleanor's confessions, the diary's faded ink, the neat cruelty of James's smile. Dawn came thin and gray, and with it a determination I hadn't felt in years. I dialed Marcus's number before I could talk myself out of it. He answered on the second ring, his voice warm and steady in the way that had made him a sanctuary for so many women at the shelter. "Marcus," I said, "do you remember you mentioned your daughter? The lawyer? The one who helped the shelter with those fraud cases?" There was a pause, as if he could see me through the line. "Rachel?" "Yes. She'll be in town this morning for a consultation." "Gee, Jude, are you all right?" I told him everything in a rush, the words tumbling out, the diary, the hospital records, the photographs, Eleanor's confession, the restraining order notice. He listened without interruption, the kind of listening that steadies a person. "Come by the shelter," he said finally. "Rachel owes me coffee. Tell her Marcus sent you and she'll make time." At 9, Rachel Martinez arrived, sharp, efficient, and somehow both softer and keener than I expected. She had the decisive stride of someone used to carrying heavy things across difficult terrain. Her suit was practical, her hair pulled back in a no-nonsense knot, and when she smiled, it was brief but genuine. She set her briefcase on my table and opened it like she was unwrapping a plan. "I read everything you sent over on the drive here," she said, settling into the chair. "Credit to Eleanor for keeping meticulous records. This is prosecutable, Judith. But it's messy and we have to move fast." "The hearing's at 2 this afternoon," I said. My voice had a brittle edge. "Can you be there?" Rachel's eyes lifted, and there was a small smile, part professional assurance, part fierce sisterhood. "I'll do better than that." She tapped her pen against a stack of photocopies. I called a colleague who works closely with the district attorney's elder fraud unit. He's agreed to shadow the hearing. If what Eleanor alleges is true, Mr. Morrison's conduct looks like multiple felonies. We worked through the morning like women assembling an armor we'd been denied for too long. Rachel cross-referenced bank statements with dates in Mom's diary, flagged accounts that led to offshore shells, and circled emails where the tone shifted from affectionate to transactional. She translated the forensic whisper of numbers into a story, one that painted James not as a wronged husband, but as a calculated predator. When we arrived at the courthouse, the corridor smelled of institutional polish and old paper. James was there, like a specter with a lawyer at his elbow, an expensive suit, hair slicked back, the kind of man who believed status could lubricate guilt. He saw Eleanor in the gallery and offered that same thin smirk he'd once used like a velvet glove. The courtroom was quiet, the kind of hush that makes petty fears swell bigger. The judge who presided was a woman in her 50s, no nonsense. The steady face of someone who'd seen many human dramas and learned to read them without flinching. "Mr. Morrison," she said when the clerk read the motion, "you are requesting a restraining order against your wife?" "Ex-wife, Your Honor," James's lawyer corrected smoothly. "Eleanor is mentally unstable. She's been harassing Mr. Morrison and making wild accusations about finances." Eleanor's hands were folded in her lap. Her fingers trembled, but she held her chin high. Rachel rose with the confidence of someone who knew the law and the lives it touched. "Your Honor," she said, voice clear and calm. "I'm Rachel Martinez, representing Eleanor Morrison and Judith Cooper. We request this hearing be postponed pending a criminal investigation." I watched James's lawyer open his mouth to object in instinctual motion and then falter as Rachel set a stack of documents on the judge's bench. Bank statements annotated, dates highlighted, forged signatures compared to samples. Mom's diary pages marked. The silence that followed was like the intake of a breath before a plunge. The judge read, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the papers. The mood in the room shifted. Whispers stopped. The murmurs snuffed like candles. "These are serious allegations," she said slowly, not unkindly. "Mr. Morrison, the court denies your request for a restraining order at this time and refers this matter to the district attorney's office for immediate review." Relief was a sudden, strange thing, hot and dizzying. I felt as if I were walking on water and couldn't quite trust the surface. James's face, however, didn't crumble. It darkened. He left the bench with the same measured stride of a man used to getting its way in most rooms. Outside the courthouse, his threat found me like a thrown stone. "You think you're clever?" he said, with the casual menace of a man who believed words could be weapons. He cornered me near the curb where rain puddles stained the asphalt. "I'll destroy both of you. That evidence won't hold up." I remember the exact way the sunlight fractured on his watch as he moved his hand. For a moment, I felt small, like the frightened girl who had once begged the universe for reasons. Then, the lawyer's presence beside me, Rachel's hand on my arm, steadied me. "We'll see," I said, voice flat but hard. Inside, my heart pounded a tempo I refused to let audible. Rachel pulled me aside with an urgency that made my stomach drop. "Judith," she said, lowering her voice, "there's more." While we were doing preliminary checks, we found patterns. James hasn't just done this once. Not even twice. He's got at least 2 other cases that resemble your situation, both involving sisters. One of those sisters is alive and wants to speak. The world narrowed. My mouth felt dry as paper. "He's done this before?" I whispered. Rachel nodded. "Worse, the first woman, Beth, died under suspicious circumstances. Her sister believes Mr. Morrison was involved, but there was never enough evidence to pursue a murder case." The phrase lodged cold in my chest. The idea that a string of similar stories could connect like beads on a wire made me feel suddenly very small in a very large, dangerous network. Panic wagged at the edges of my resolve, but it did not take root. Instead, something else rose, an instinct as old as my bones. Protect, gather, expose. "Who is she?" I asked, the question like a key sliding into a lock. "The sister who's willing to testify?" "Margaret Flynn," Rachel said. "She's coming down from Chicago. She remembers details no one else noticed. Little things James said, patterns she traced afterward. She thinks her sister's death wasn't an accident. Hearing her name was strange, unmooring." The pieces on the table rearranged themselves into a broader silhouette. A pattern of charm, isolation, financial extraction, disappearance. A man whose smile had cost women both money and lives. I felt a hollow sickness in my stomach, not of weakness, but of recognition. To be part of a pattern was to be stripped of the comfortable notion that your suffering was unique, but it also meant you were no longer alone in it. There were other women who had kept lists in drawers, who had whispered and circled names in journals, and then were ignored. Now, those whispers had a voice loud enough to call an office to get a judge's attention. Rachel's hand found mine again, this time with the authority of someone placing a compass on a map. "We'll connect you with DA investigators," she said. "We'll get Margaret to testify. We'll build a chain from the Seattle property sale to offshore accounts and to the other victims. It won't be simple, and it won't be quick, but it's not impossible. I thought of Eleanor's thin frame on my couch, of the diary with its pressed violets and worried scrawl. I thought of my mother's trust, signed away on a document that probably bore the ghost of my name. I thought of a life I could reclaim, not for the money, though that mattered, but for the agency it represented. On the drive home, Rachel sat beside me and we talked in patterns of logistics and reassurance. Between legalities, she offered small, human things. Bring Mrs. Chun into the loop if you need a safe space. Don't let Eleanor go anywhere alone. Sleep when you can. The practical tenderness of her counsel felt like a garland placed gently around a bruised heart. That night, I went to bed exhausted in a way that felt earned. My dreams were not the hollow hauntings of weeks past, but jagged, busy things. Courtrooms and ledgers, the faces of women standing in line, some known and some only remembered by a name. In the morning, the air seemed clearer, as if the act of speaking and unraveling had let some trapped breath escape. When I closed my eyes, I could hear Eleanor's apology from days before, and the low, steady certainty that had been forged in me since. It was no longer just about reclaiming a house or bank accounts. It was about stitching a pattern of wrongs into a rope long enough to pull down a man who had believed himself untouchable. It was about standing in a courtroom and saying, with a voice that would not crack, that we are not invisible. Justice can be slow. It can be partial, and it can be cruel. But tonight, I slept with the stubborn belief that we had begun something. We had lawyers and witnesses, and a judge who had already paused a lie. We had Rachel's sharp intelligence and Marcus's quiet faith. We had Eleanor's evidence and a sister in Chicago ready to speak. And most crucially, we had each other. Margaret Flynn arrived the next morning, her presence like a storm that had already decided its course long before reaching land. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair swept into a no-nonsense bun. Her posture straight despite the fatigue of travel. Her eyes, however, were what struck me most sharp, unyielding, yet heavy with the kind of grief that had aged into purpose. When she shook my hand, her grip was strong enough to tell me she was not here for sympathy. She was here for truth. We sat in my living room, the morning light stretching across the rug in pale, uncertain ribbons. Eleanor perched beside me, her body frail, but her gaze alert. Rachel had joined us too, her briefcase open, her notepad ready. It felt like the quiet before a confession none of us could fully prepare for. James married my sister Beth 20 years ago, Margaret began, her voice steady, measured, but with an undertone of ache that trembled just beneath the words. He isolated her from everyone, family, friends, even her job, said he wanted to protect her. He took over the finances, sold her car, changed their phone numbers. Then one afternoon, Beth fell down the stairs in their home. Massive head trauma. It was ruled an accident. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. He told me he was widowed, she whispered, that his first wife died of cancer. He said it changed him forever. Margaret gave a small, bitter smile. He probably tells everyone something different. He's an expert at shaping stories to fit what people need to hear. I tried to investigate after Beth's death, but he'd covered every trace, deleted emails, closed accounts, disappeared from her bank records. The police said I was grieving, paranoid. Then, 5 years later, I heard about another case, a woman named Patricia in Denver. Same pattern, married, isolated, then she vanished. Never found. I felt the blood drain from my face. The air in the room seemed to shrink. Eleanor, I said softly, turning toward her, when you got sick, did James seem concerned? Or did he seem almost pleased? Eleanor's lips trembled. Her hands, already fragile, began to shake. He insisted I sign a new will last month. Everything left to him. He said it was to simplify things when I passed, but I refused. Her voice cracked then, and she wiped at her cheek quickly, almost angrily. That's when he tried to have me committed again. He said I was becoming a danger to myself. Rachel leaned forward, her pen forgotten. "This changes everything," she said, her tone sharpened by both outrage and focus. We can prove a pattern of predatory behavior, a string of manipulations tied to financial gain. We can build a case not just for fraud, but for criminal negligence and coercion, maybe even something darker. But we need undeniable evidence, not just testimony. I stared down at the steaming mug in my hands, the surface of the tea trembling from my unsteady grip. An idea was forming in the back of my mind, dangerous but clear. "James is planning to marry again," I said slowly. "That widow in Seattle, Catherine Bennett. What if we warn her?" Margaret shook her head immediately. "She won't believe you. Beth's best friend tried to warn me once, before it all happened. I thought she was just jealous, bitter about losing touch. James has a way of turning concern into poison. He'll make her think you're the crazy one." Eleanor looked up suddenly, her eyes sharp despite the pallor of her illness. "Wait," she said, sitting straighter. "The wedding, it's being planned by James's business partner, Richard Chun. But Richard's wife, she's your neighbor, isn't she, Judith?" For a second, I didn't understand. Then the image came to me. Mrs. Chun, her kind face framed by dark hair, streaked with gray, waving from across the fence, bringing dumplings when I was sick, knocking on my window that night when James showed up uninvited. The woman who had seen more than she ever said. "Yes," I said slowly. "Mrs. Chun. She's always been so kind. She knows more than she lets on, I think." Eleanor nodded faintly. "Richard has access to James's business accounts. If anyone knows where the money really is or how to trace it, it's him. If you could talk to her, maybe she could help us without knowing it." Rachel exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "That's risky, but it might be our best lead. We'll need hard evidence connecting James's financial activities to the forged will and the offshore transfers. If Richard Chun's firm is involved, that's the missing piece." The room felt heavier now. Outside, the wind rattled the window pane. For a moment, we all just sat there, breathing in unison, the faint sound of the clock filling the silence. Then, quietly, I stood. "I'll talk to her," I said. "She trusts me. I'll find a way." That evening, I baked a batch of oatmeal cookies, the kind Mrs. Chun loved, with extra cinnamon. My hands trembled as I mixed the batter, and I told myself it was just fatigue, not fear. When the cookies were golden, I arranged them on a plate, still warm, the scent of sugar and spice filling the air. It felt almost absurd walking down the short path between our houses carrying something so ordinary, when my heart was thundering with something extraordinary resolve. When she opened the door, her face lit up as always. "Judith, you shouldn't have." "Oh, they smell delicious." I smiled, though my chest ached with nerves. "Just a little thank you for checking on us the other day. Eleanor's feeling better." She waved me inside, her living room softly lit, a pot of tea already steaming on the table. "You're such a dear. How are you holding up? You've seemed worried lately." I sat down, the plate between us. "There's something I need to talk to you about, Mrs. Chun, and I wouldn't ask if it weren't important." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Of course. What's wrong?" I hesitated, feeling the weight of the secret pressing against my ribs. "It's about Richard." "And his business partner, James Morrison." Her expression changed instantly, not alarmed, but wary. She set down her cup. "What about them?" "James has been involved in a series of fraudulent activities," I said gently, watching her closely. "He's hurt people, Mrs. Chun. My sister, for one. We believe he may be planning something similar with the woman he's about to marry. Richard might not know the full extent, but he could have access to documents, bank transfers, account numbers that could prove what James has done." Mrs. Chun's eyes flickered. She didn't speak for several seconds. Then, quietly, she said, "Richard has been uneasy lately. He mentioned things that didn't add up. Late-night calls, missing funds, sudden consultations in Seattle. He even said he didn't trust James anymore, but he wouldn't elaborate. I felt my pulse quicken. If Richard suspects something, maybe he's already keeping copies of the records. She nodded slowly, a decision forming on her face. He's in Hong Kong for a conference, but I have the password to his office safe. He asked me to check the mail while he's gone. If there's anything there, I'll find it. Emotion caught in my throat. Mrs. Chun, are you sure? This could be dangerous. She gave me a small, knowing smile. Judith, you've been my neighbor for 15 years. I've seen that man drive you to tears, and I've seen you rebuild yourself after. If there's a chance to expose him, I'll take it. We sat in silence for a long moment. Two women who had lived too many years under the quiet rules of endurance. Then she reached out, placed her hand over mine, and said softly, "We'll do this carefully. No one ever expects the quiet ones to be watching." When I left her house, the night air felt different. Live, charged, almost conspiratorial. The streetlights hummed, and the leaves whispered overhead. For the first time in years, I felt the faint thrill of purpose thrumming through me. We weren't just reacting anymore. We were moving, planning, connecting threads between women who had suffered too long in silence. Back inside, Eleanor was asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to her chin. I watched her breathe, fragile and steady, and thought of Margaret upstairs in the guest room, sitting awake perhaps, tracing old memories into the darkness. 3 women, bound not by blood, but by survival, aligning their pain into something sharper, something that could cut through the lies of a man who thought he'd never be caught. Tomorrow would bring its own dangers, but for now the night held a fragile, glowing hope. It was the kind of hope that trembles like a candle, but refuses to go out. The moment Mrs. Chun closed the door behind me, the warmth of her tiny entryway seemed to seep into my bones. For a second, I let myself be a neighbor again, carrying a plate of cookies, exchanging small talk about rain and the grocery sale, before the words I'd rehearsed all afternoon spilled out like something I could no longer hold inside. "Judith, what's wrong?" she asked, her smile folding into concern the second she saw my face. Her hands were soft and sure as she set the plate on her table. The scent of jasmine tea rose between us. For years she had been the kind of neighbor who noticed the mundane details of my life, a loose roof tile, an overdue letter, and somehow those small attentions had anchored me. Now I leaned on that anchor. I told her everything. Not in neat cinematic revelations, but in the halting way truth often comes, pieces first, then the pattern. Eleanor's diary, the forged signatures, the hospital records, the photo of James outside a hospital with someone else's arm around him, Rachel's presence at the courthouse, Margaret's story from Chicago. I watched her face for shock. Instead, it softened into something I couldn't have expected. She sighed. Relief and a long-held worry exhaled in the same breath. "I've been worried about Richard," she admitted quietly. "He's been stressed for months, drinking more than usual. He kept saying James was getting away with murder, but he would never explain." Her fingers, thin from years of gardening, trembled on the teacup. "He said things that didn't add up, but he was afraid. He said James had ways of making problems disappear." The admission landed with a dull thud in my chest. "Can you get him to meet with us? Please, it's important." My voice was small, the kind of plea that had once softened my mother's resolve when I was a child. That night, when Richard Chun finally sat at my kitchen table, his face was drawn and haggard like someone who had been carrying a heavy bag for too long. He smelled faintly of cigarettes and stressed, 2 things that had never been part of the man who'd once brought Mrs. Chun roses on their anniversary. He clasped his hands together as if to stop them from shaking. "I've wanted to come forward for 2 years, he said, voice low, "but James has dirt on me. Years ago I made a mistake falsifying some tax documents for the company to cover a shortfall. I thought I could fix it. James found out and threatened me. He said he'd turn me in if I ever said anything. So I kept my head down. He looked at me with an honesty that felt almost like an apology. I've been trying to sleep with one eye open. Rachel's presence was steady and practical. She leaned forward, laptop open, eyes taking him in with a clinician's focus, but a friend's softness. "We can't protect you," she said plainly. "If you cooperate with the district attorney and with federal investigators, they can offer you immunity for certain actions. They won't turn you into a scapegoat. But you have to be truthful and you have to be willing to hand over what you have." He slid his phone across the table as if the device itself were a small, heavy brick. "I've been documenting everything," he said. The screen lit up with names and numbers and figures that made my head swim. Transfers to shell companies. Emails with odd instructions about client stewardship. Offshore accounts and names that don't match any of the businesses James lists on his papers. But there's something you don't know yet. He pulled out a folder then, and when he opened it, it was like opening a battered trunk. There were bank records, account printouts, CSV files printed like evidence in a period drama. He pointed to line items that at first glance looked innocuous, small withdrawals here, scheduled transfers there, but when you followed the thread, a pattern emerged. Donations that were actually rerouted payments. Counseling fees that had been siphoned to accounts in different names. Little nests of theft, all threaded back to the same hub. "This is bigger than you know," Richard said, voice barely above a whisper. James didn't just take Judith's inheritance. He built a business model out of grief. He runs a grief counseling service, a front that attracts widows, divorcees, women in transition. He offers them guidance, rides them through their hardest days, and then exploits their vulnerability. He isolates them from family, convinces them he's the only safe hand, then he siphons their assets. He's been doing it for at least 15 years. I felt fury rise then, a hot, bright thing that made the blood sing in my ears. How many? The question was small and terrible. "At least a dozen that we can track," Richard said. "Maybe more. I have names, dates, amounts. Over $8 million that I can see." He washed his hands over his face as if trying to cool the revelation. I thought it was one stupid thing, then another. Then it formed into this pattern. Once I started looking, it was everywhere. Eleanor began to cry, a thin sound that broke my heart into jagged pieces. "I helped him," she sobbed. "I didn't know. He used me as proof that he could save people. I was his success story. I introduced him to women. I smiled so they'd trust him. I thought I was helping. I didn't know the ledger behind his words. I took her hand without thinking. It was fragile and warm and impossibly real. 'You didn't know,' I said, and I meant it with the whole beating of me. 'You were used. You're a victim too.'" Rachel was already at her computer, fingers moving like quick, pragmatic birds. "This is organized crime," she said, voice steady but taut. "It's not a simple civil fraud. The use of shell companies, the movement through different jurisdictions that can cross into federal territory. Richard, we need you to meet with the FBI. Tomorrow. And we need you to hand over everything you have." We were mid-sentence armchairs crowded with documents, our lives suddenly full of litigious nouns. When Richard's phone buzzed, he glanced at it, and the color drained from his face faster than any winter cloud. He read aloud, voice flat with shock, a photograph of his daughter, a campus dorm, the text attached, "Accidents happen." The room shrank, all its angles sharpened into a single point of dread. Mrs. Chun, who had been hovering at the edge of the kitchen, her expression a map of fear and determination, grabbed his arm and urged him to call the police. "We have to go now," she whispered. "We can't sit here." Her instinct was the bravest form of ordinary courage, but something in me shifted, a dangerous, necessary thing that felt older than law and younger than fear. The years of being powerless had taught me one lesson with blunt clarity. When predators threaten what you love, you have to make choices about the kind of danger you will accept. I pressed my palms flat against the table and felt its familiar grain. The women around me, Eleanor pale and trembling, Margaret's sharp sorrow, Rachel's precise competence, Richard's shaken guilt, Mrs. Chun's protective fury, were not the kinds of people who would cower. We were people who had been worn thin by waiting. Now we had to decide how to act. "I understand going to the police," I said slowly, my voice a low, deliberate thing. "And we will. But sometimes the system moves too slow. He's planning a wedding. He's about to pour that money into vehicles that will disappear from our reach. If we rely only on them, he may get everything moved before anyone can touch it." Saying the words made my stomach clench. I felt the pull of legality on one side and raw instinct on the other. There was a long silence, heavy as an untouched ledger. Everyone's eyes flicked to one another, measuring the distance between caution and urgency. Rachel looked at me with an expression I did not know how to read, part lawyerly alarm, part sisterly alignment. "I have a different idea," I said finally, and the sentence felt like stepping off a curb. Or, rather, a plan. A risky one. Dangerous in ways I can already name. I stopped, because the truth was that some plans sounded cleaner in theory than they did in the bone-deep responsibility of actually making them happen. Mrs. Chun's hand tightened on Richard's sleeve. "Judith," she began. I swallowed. "I'm not talking about violence. I don't want blood on anyone's hands. But he thrives on control and spectacle. He believes himself immune. Maybe we use that against him, force him into a place where he exposes himself, make him think he's untouchable, make him brag, make him make a mistake that we can turn into evidence they can't ignore." The room held its breath. The idea was a sparked, terrifying, perhaps reckless, but it lit something in my chest that had been cold for a long time. I could feel Eleanor's fingers clench mine. Margaret's jaw set like a line drawn to the horizon. Richard's eyes wet with fear and a flicker of resolve. Rachel's face, unreadable, slid into a hard expression of calculation. "We'll do it with the law at our side," Rachel said at last. "We involve the DA and the FBI, but we'll also create conditions where James slips where the cameras, the recordings, the witnesses are ready. We do not become the villains in his script. We become the authors of the evidence." It was a balancing act I could not fully explain. A moral tightrope that trembled under the weight of the choices we had to make. For a moment, I felt like the 16-year-old Judith standing between my sister and the world, promising that I would always try to protect what was right. For the first time in a long while, the rage inside me felt channeled into something that might actually change the small geometry of our lives. Outside the window, the streetlight hummed. Inside, we bent over the documents again, this time not just as victims, but as conspirators in the pursuit of a kinder, quieter justice. We would call the police, we would go to the DA, we would tell the FBI, but we would also prepare, carefully and without malice, to make sure that when James came slithering back into his confident life, there would be no clean way out. The betrayal in this room was not only his. It had nested inside marriages, inside silence, inside the comfortable assumptions of neighbors and systems. We were unmasking it. It felt like a betrayal, too, to step into trickery, even for a righteous cause. But I thought of Eleanor's thin hands, of the diary with its violet press between the pages, of all the women whose names Richard had uncovered. I thought of the quiet of mornings I had once allowed to be stolen by fear. "I know it's dangerous," I said, voice small and steady. "But sometimes the only way to stop a predator is to show him the net he thinks he can escape. We'll be careful, we'll be legal where we can, and we'll be merciless where he has been merciless to others." Margaret's lips curved into something that nearly looked like a smile, sharp and fierce. Good, she said, because he's been getting away with murder long enough. We made our decisions in the dim light of the kitchen, a cluster of weary, stubborn women who had been taught to endure. Now we would teach someone else what it meant to be accountable. The cost felt high, the fear real, but in that moment, standing among documents and teacups and trembling phones, I felt the old buried courage stir. It was dangerous, it was necessary, and it felt, strangely, like the first honest thing I had done in 15 years. 2 weeks passed as if time itself were holding its breath. Every day carried the quiet ache of waiting, the kind that sharpens the senses and blurs sleep. Eleanor and I rehearsed her lines over and over until the pauses between words felt natural, the tremor in her voice believable. When she finally called James, her hands were steady, but mine weren't. I stood beside her, clutching a mug that had long gone cold, watching her play the role of her life. "James," she began softly, voice trembling with practiced sorrow, "I've been thinking about everything, about how wrong I was. The treatments, the medication, they've made me confused, paranoid even. I said terrible things." The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. Then his voice, smooth as silk and twice as suffocating. "Of course, darling. You've been through so much. I never blamed you." I could almost see his expression through the phone, his brow furrowed just enough to feign concern, his mouth curved in that counterfeit sympathy he used like a scalpel. Eleanor played her part perfectly, crying softly, promising to make it right. When the call ended, she exhaled, trembling from the effort of it. "He bought it," she whispered. Her eyes clearer now, stronger met mine. "He thinks I'm coming home." He didn't know that under her blouse, taped neatly against her skin, was a small black wire. Every word he spoke, every manipulation and half-truth would now have a witness. The plan felt like something out of a thriller, and yet it was heartbreakingly human. We weren't spies. We were women clawing our way out of silence. The charity gala in Seattle had been Catherine Bennett's idea, or so James believed. She had lost her husband to cancer 2 years earlier, and her grief had been the entryway James needed. He had met her at a fundraising committee, then quickly inserted himself into her world, offering comfort, advice, and a vision of renewed purpose. Now she was hosting a gala for cancer research, the perfect place for him to display his charm and philanthropy and to secure his next victim. We decided that would be the night. Eleanor would accompany him as his reconciled wife. Rachel would be there, blending in among the guests, her sharp eyes watching from every corner, while FBI agents moved through the crowd in tuxedos and evening gowns. I would attend under a different name, Dr. Judith Cooper, introduced as a cancer research advocate Eleanor had recommended. My years volunteering at the women's shelter had given me enough credibility to make the role plausible. The night of the gala arrived with a strange stillness. My living room was bathed in amber light, and on the couch lay the dress Eleanor had sent me, a deep blue gown that shimmered faintly when I moved. Elegant, powerful. Not the kind of beauty that begged to be seen, but the kind that asserted itself quietly. As I slipped into it, I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't see the woman James had tried to break. I saw someone who had walked through fire and still carried light. My hair, streaked with silver now, framed a face that had finally stopped apologizing for surviving. When I arrived at the hotel ballroom, the sight took my breath away. Crystal chandeliers cast golden rain over the guests, and the air hummed with the low murmur of laughter, clinking glasses, and the soft swell of violins. Waiters moved like choreography, carrying trays of champagne. And then I saw him. James stood near the center of the room, handsome in his tuxedo, smiling with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. His arm rested around Eleanor's waist. She looked radiant, her pale gown flowing like peace itself. but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened ever so slightly on her clutch. Next to them was Catherine Benite, a woman in her late 50s, warm and kind-faced, wearing a diamond necklace that glittered like tears under the chandeliers. Her laughter was soft and trusting, the kind of sound that made my chest ache. Rachel passed behind me, her silver dress catching the light. She didn't glance my way, but I saw the subtle signal. The mission was live. Agents had already positioned themselves among the donors and socialites. Everything was ready. Across the room, Eleanor met my gaze. For a brief second, time seemed to slow. She nodded, just once. It was time. I crossed the room with careful grace, my heels clicking softly on the marble floor. The air was perfumed with champagne and lilies. When I reached Catherine, she turned to me with that open, unguarded kindness that I had come to recognize as both her beauty and her danger. "Mrs. Bennet," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Dr. Judith Cooper. Thank you for hosting this beautiful evening. The pleasure is mine," she said warmly. "Cancer took my husband 2 years ago. When James introduced me to his wife Eleanor and her brave fight, I knew I had to do more. This event, it's in his honor." She reached out, touching Eleanor's hand affectionately. "You're an inspiration, my dear." Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes shimmering. I knew she was recording every second, her courage wrapped in silk and poise. James hadn't looked at me yet. He was engrossed in a conversation with the senator, his laughter practiced, his body language effortless. But when Catherine turned to him and said, "James is helping me establish a foundation in my late husband's name. He's been so generous with financial advice," I saw Eleanor stiffen. It was happening again. Right there, in front of us. Another performance, another trap being set under the guise of kindness. "Mrs. Bennet," I said carefully, my voice calm but carrying enough weight to draw attention. "Before you make any financial commitments, there's something you should know about James Morrison." For a split second, the room went quiet around us. Catherine's brows furrowed, a flicker of confusion crossing her gentle face. Eleanor's breathing hitched. Then James turned toward me. The moment his eyes met mine, recognition bloomed like a dark stain. I watched it travel across his features, the disbelief, the flicker of anger, the precise, cold calculation that had always preceded his cruelty. "Judith," he said finally, his voice low and sharp as glass. "My God, I almost didn't recognize you." His tone was half amusement, half warning. The predator's charm turning its gaze back to prey, but I didn't look away. "It's Dr. Cooper now," I said quietly. "I advocate for women recovering from loss and exploitation. Perhaps you've heard of our work." Eleanor's hand tightened around her glass. Rachel, a few steps away, subtly adjusted her earpiece. I could feel the air around us thicken, like the moment before a storm breaks. James smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Always dramatic, Judith. Still making up stories?" Catherine blinked, looking from me to him. "Stories? What is she talking about?" "Please," James said smoothly, his mask back in place. "My ex-wife has certain issues. It's part of why our marriage ended. The stress of her family's financial troubles, well, you can't imagine." He was already rewriting the narrative, twisting truth into performance. This time, the script wasn't his. "Mrs. Bennet," I said again, turning to her gently, "please, just listen. James isn't who you think he is. He's hurt people, many people. He preys on women at their most vulnerable. But tonight, for once, we have proof." Eleanor's voice trembled as she added, "He's lying to you, Catherine. He lied to me too." James's expression hardened. "Enough," he hissed, barely moving his lips. "You have no idea what you're doing." But in his anger, he didn't notice Rachel's subtle signal to the agents nearby. He didn't see the small device Eleanor had slipped from her clutch, placing it on the table between the champagne flutes. The wire was transmitting everything. James took a step closer to me, lowering his voice. You think you can destroy me with this circus? His breath was sharp with arrogance. You've always been weak, Judith. Always needed saving. My heart was pounding, but I held his gaze. Not anymore. Then, somewhere behind us, a voice cut through the music, firm, clear, and commanding. Mr. Morrison, FBI, please step aside. The ballroom froze. Guests turned, murmuring in confusion as two agents approached, badges gleaming under the chandeliers. For the first time, I saw it, the flicker of fear in James's eyes. Eleanor exhaled, tears welling as she whispered, "It's over." And as they led him away, the music faltered, the laughter dimmed, and the weight of 15 years lifted, quietly, reverently, like dawn breaking after a long, dark night. The ballroom lights glittered like stars against the marble floor, each reflection sharp and cold. The murmur of polite laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air, a symphony of wealth and pretense. I stood near the edge of the crowd, my heart pounding so violently I could feel it in my throat. Eleanor was beside me, pale and trembling, her arm looped tightly through mine for balance and courage. We'd planned every step of this moment, every word, but now that it was here, it felt like standing at the edge of a storm that could either cleanse or destroy everything. Then I saw him, James, moving through the crowd with that same effortless confidence that had fooled everyone for years. His tuxedo was perfectly pressed, his smile rehearsed and charming. But when his eyes found me, for the briefest second, the mask cracked. Something dark flashed behind his expression before he smoothed it over. "Judith," he said, his voice like silk wrapping around a blade. "What a surprise, is it?" My voice came out steadier than I expected. I lifted my chin. "Catherine, this man is not who he claims to be. He's a fraud, a theophant, possibly a murderer." The room fell into stunned silence. Gasps rippled through the crowd like a gust of wind passing through dry leaves. Catherine Bennett, the poised and elegant hostess, blinked in confusion, her hand instinctively going to her pearl necklace. "James, who is this woman? He didn't miss a beat. My ex-sister-in-law," he said smoothly, with that infuriating half-smile that had deceived so many. "Judith has never forgiven me for falling in love with her sister. She's been stalking us for years. It's... rather sad, actually." His words hung in the air, poised, honey. Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others whispered, but I didn't flinch. I'd been waiting for this moment, for truth to finally rise, raw and undeniable. "Is that what you told Eleanor?" I said quietly, pulling my phone from my purse. My hands didn't tremble this time, because these bank records tell a different story. I connected my phone to the venue's presentation screen. The enormous display behind me flickered, and then the numbers began to appear. Bank transfers, offshore accounts, forged signatures, each more damning than the last. The evidence Richard had uncovered, Eleanor's statements, Rachel's files, it was all there. Gasps turned to murmurs. People craned their necks to see. Catherine's eyes widened in disbelief. James took a step back, the cornered predator beneath the polished exterior starting to show. "This is absurd," he began, but another voice cut him off. "Mr. Morrison," said Rachel, stepping forward from the crowd, her posture calm but commanding. "I'm FBI Special Agent Rachel Martinez. We've been investigating you for wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse." Her badge flashed under the lights. Agents began moving quietly through the crowd, coordinated and precise. The tension in the air snapped like an overstretched string. "You're under arrest," Rachel said evenly. For a moment, time seemed to hold its breath. Then James laughed, low, cruel, incredulous. "You think you're clever?" He grabbed Eleanor suddenly, yanking her close against him. The room erupted into gasps and shouts. "Eleanor's dying anyway," he sneered. And Judith, his eyes burned into mine, Wild now. You'll never prove I took that money. Those signatures are perfect forgeries. Actually, Eleanor's voice broke through the chaos weak, but clear, cutting through the noise like a bell. They're not forgeries. James froze. Everyone went silent again. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached into her dress and pulled out a small silver recording device. I signed them, she continued, tears in her eyes, but her voice steady. You coerced me, threatened me, manipulated me, but I signed them. And I've been recording every conversation we've had for the past 2 weeks. She held up the recorder for all to see, including the one last night, where you admitted to Beth Flynn's murder and Patricia Martinez's disappearance. The crowd erupted. Catherine covered her mouth, horrified. Rachel's agent surged forward, but James reacted first, his face twisted into something feral. He shoved Eleanor away and lunged toward me, eyes blazing with hatred. But I wasn't the same woman he thought he could intimidate. All those months at the shelter, those evenings learning to defend myself, had changed me. I sidestepped, caught his arm, and turned my body just enough for him to lose balance. He stumbled forward, directly into the waiting hands of 2 FBI agents. "Let me go!" he roared, thrashing as they pinned him down. "You'll regret this, all of you." The room erupted into chaos, but this time it was the chaos of justice being restored. I stood there, chest heaving, my pulse still racing, but inside me, something loosened. The years of fear, guilt, silence, they cracked and fell away, piece by piece. As they cuffed him and led him toward the exit, a voice came from behind me. Margaret Flynn, her eyes red and glistening with tears, stepped forward. "That's for my sister Beth," she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and relief. "You monster!" James didn't look at her. He just spat curses under his breath as they dragged him out. Catherine approached me next, her elegant hands trembling. How did I not see it? She said softly, her eyes filled with disbelief. He was so charming, so attentive. "That's his weapon," I said gently. "He finds good people and exploits their kindness. But you're safe now. We all are." Catherine nodded, tears sliding down her face. She turned away as the agents escorted James through the double doors, their steps echoing against the marble. The sound was final. Then I heard Eleanor's faint gasp. I turned and saw her collapsing. I caught her before she hit the floor, holding her close as the paramedics rushed over. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her lips trembling. "For everything. For being weak." I pressed my forehead against hers, my tears falling freely now. "You weren't weak," I said. "You survived. You fought back. You're the strongest person I know." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Judith, we did it." "Yes," I whispered, my throat tight. "We did." As they lifted her onto the stretcher, I felt something inside me break open, not from pain, but release. For so long, I had carried the weight of other people's sins, of silence, of fear. Now, watching James being driven away in handcuffs, I finally understood that survival isn't just about escaping. It's about standing in the light after years of darkness, refusing to be silent ever again. Rachel approached, her expression softening. "You were brave, Judith," she said. "Most people freeze in a moment like that. But you," she smiled, "you moved." I managed a small laugh through my tears. Maybe all those classes at the shelter paid off after all. "They did," she said warmly. "And more than that, you gave Eleanor her voice back." I looked toward the ambulance, where Eleanor's hand reached weakly out the door, and I went to her. I held her hand tightly until the doors closed. The sirens began to wail, fading into the night, leaving behind the echo of justice, long delayed but finally delivered. When I turned back to the ballroom, the crowd had mostly dispersed. Only the aftermath remained, the fragments of a world that had believed a lie. But I didn't feel anger anymore, only peace. James had looked back one last time as they took him away, his eyes burning with the promise of revenge. but I had only smiled, not with hatred, not with triumph, but with the quiet certainty that truth had already won. For the first time in years, I breathed freely. Justice had come, and with it, something even more precious: freedom. Eleanor spent her final 6 weeks in my home, and during that time, the world seemed to slow down. The chaos had ended, justice had been served, and what remained was silence, the kind that carries both peace and sorrow. My house became a sanctuary for two sisters learning to be whole again. We spent long afternoons wrapped in blankets, talking for hours. Sometimes we laughed until our sides ached. Other times we simply sat together in quiet reflection, letting the past unfold like an old photograph, creased, faded, but still precious. We spoke of our childhood, of the long summers by the lake, of the way Mom used to hum while baking bread. Eleanor would pause sometimes, her voice catching when she spoke of the years we lost, the years she spent trapped in a life built on lies, the years I spent resenting her absence. "I don't know how you can even look at me," she said one evening, her hand trembling as she stirred her tea. "I betrayed you, Judith. I betrayed everyone who ever loved me." I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. "Enough," I said softly. "You've apologized enough. You're forgiven. You always were." She cried, then deep, shuddering sobs that came from years of guilt finally breaking open. I held her until she stopped shaking, and when she finally looked up, her eyes were filled not with shame, but with something new: peace. James's trial came and went swiftly, though the memories of it will likely stay with me forever. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with the weight of truth. With Richard's testimony, the recordings, and Margaret's heartbreaking evidence about Beth, the verdict was inevitable. James Morrison, fraudster, manipulator, predator, was sentenced to 35 years for fraud, coercion, and manslaughter. The district attorney was still building a murder case, but I didn't need to wait for another trial to feel justice settle in my bones. When the sentence was read, Eleanor squeezed my hand. She didn't smile. She just exhaled, as if letting go of a burden she'd carried for decades. The money was recovered in full: my inheritance, plus restitution for 12 other women James had scammed. I kept what was rightfully mine, but I couldn't keep the rest. It didn't belong to me. So the first created a fund in their names, distributing the recovered wealth to help them rebuild their lives. Many of them had lost everything: homes, dignity, trust. Watching them receive even a fragment of justice reminded me that healing often begins not in grand gestures, but in small acts of restoration. Catherine Bennett, who had once been James's latest target, became one of my closest friends. Together we established something new: a real foundation, not for cancer research, as James had pretended, but for victims of financial and emotional abuse. We called it the Eleanor Morrison Fund, in honor of my sister's courage. The name felt right. Eleanor wasn't a symbol of shame anymore. She was proof that redemption, though painful, was possible. On a quiet Tuesday morning in early spring, I found Eleanor sitting by the window, sunlight touching her face like a blessing. She smiled when she saw me and reached out her hand. I took it, and we sat there for a while, listening to the sound of the wind brushing against the curtains. "Judith," she whispered after a while, her voice barely more than breath, "thank you for seeing past what I did, to who I really was." Her fingers grew still in mine. That was how she left this world, peacefully, gently, her last expression one of gratitude. At her funeral, the air smelled of lilacs. The ceremony was small but heartfelt, Mrs. Chun. Rachel, Margaret, Catherine, and others whose lives she had quietly touched in her final weeks. When it was my turn to speak, I looked out at the small gathering and felt both the ache of loss and the fullness of love. "My sister made mistakes," I began, my voice shaking slightly. "But she also made them right. She chose courage over fear, truth over lies. That's the Eleanor I'll remember." When I finished, there wasn't a sound. Just the wind and the faint rustle of leaves in the cemetery trees. 6 months later, I found myself standing once more in the women's shelter where I had volunteered for years, but this time I was its new director. Life has a strange way of coming full circle. The Seattle house that had once been taken from Eleanor and me was now ours again, restored, repurposed, reborn. We had turned it into transitional housing for survivors of abuse. Mrs. Chun entered my office one afternoon with 2 steaming cups of tea. "You've changed," she observed, her wise eyes soft and knowing. "You're lighter somehow." I smiled, setting aside the paperwork that seemed to multiply daily. "I learned something important," I said. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or pretending something didn't hurt. It's about refusing to let someone else's cruelty define your future." She nodded approvingly. "Then you've truly healed." That evening, I stood on my porch, watching the Portland sunset spill gold and rose over the horizon. My phone rang. Catherine, calling about new foundation business. A text from Margaret popped up next, with photos of her newborn granddaughter wrapped in a pink blanket. Rachel had emailed case files for 3 new women who needed help. My heart swelled. My life was full again, not perfect, not simple, but full. Built from the ashes of what had been destroyed, made stronger by the choice to rebuild instead of resent. As the last light faded, I went inside and opened the wooden box Eleanor had given me that first day. Beneath Mom's old diary, there was an envelope I'd never opened. My name was written in Eleanor's familiar, looping handwriting. I unfolded the letter carefully, her words blooming across the page like a quiet melody. "Judith, you always were the strong one. I just hope when the time comes, you'll remember, the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. Don't become indifferent to the good in this world. Fight for it. That's your real superpower. Love, your twin." I pressed the letter to my heart and closed my eyes. The night outside was still and vast, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny promises. I looked up, feeling her presence beside me, gentle and steady as ever. "I will," I whispered. "I promise." The next morning brought new challenges, new stories, new women walking through the shelter's doors carrying their own invisible scars. Each one of them reminded me of who I once was, lost, afraid, searching for a way out. But now I knew what to tell them. I knew what to offer, beyond paperwork and counseling, hope. Because I had learned that true strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising every single time and reaching out to help others rise with you. And that's exactly what I intended to do for the rest of my life. If this story touched you, inspired you, or reminded you that healing is always possible, subscribe to the channel and join me for more stories of courage, justice, and the quiet power of second chances.